Hello, my name is Matthew Wadstein, and in this series we're going to cover the editor basics. We're going to give you an overview of how the editor is laid out as well as how to customize it. Then we're going to go and work on the viewport. What options do we have available inside the viewport and how do we navigate around it? The world outliner, how it works, what is it good for? The details panel, what does this do and what features does it give us when we use it? The modes panel, what available modes do we have when working in the editor, and then an overview of the place mode. The content browser, what is this giant thing for and how do we customize it to make it a little less unwieldy? And then finally, the main toolbar, our shortcuts to our common actions. The Unreal Engine 4 editor, which we can see here, is going to be our default interface for working with the engine and our projects. So this is our default layout. I've created a project and we're going to go ahead and cover the layout using this project. As we can see here, we have a few different windows. On the left, we have our modes window. This is where we can add some items quickly. We can work with like our landscape and our geometry. At the top, we have our main toolbar. This is where we can do things like saving our current project, going into plain editor mode, and then also testing the project out. In the middle, we have our viewport. This is our main viewport into our map so we can see what we're working with. At the bottom, we have our content browser. Basically, think of this as our file explorer for our assets inside of our project. Top right, we have our world outliner. This is an overview of all the individual items we have inside of this level. And then at the bottom, we have our details panel. And this is where we can see the individual parts for our items that we've clicked on so we can adjust them if needed. Now, the default layout is customizable. Everything in here is a window. We can move a window by clicking on the tab and dragging it and dropping it wherever we want it. We can resize windows by clicking on the dividers between windows and moving them to where we want them. We can hide the tab. So for example, I like where the content browser is. I can right click and hide the tab and now it's going to collapse it. Or we can click on that little arrow, unhide the tab, and then that will allow us to move it to the new spot. Now if we get to the point where we've moved things around and we don't really like it, we want to go back to defaults, we can go to Window, Reset Layout. After it saves, it's going to go ahead and reset the project and put our layout back to the defaults. Now there are a few hidden things that we have access to that are helpful if needed. In the top right, we have the name of our project, in this case, Editor Overview. We can see the version number of the engine we're using for this project, as well as any branch. So for example, I'm using the launcher version of 4.18, and we can see that here. Next to this, we have a little hat icon. This is for our tutorials. We can click on that, and we're now presented with a list of tutorials. We could, for example, welcome to the editor, and this will walk us through some basics of the editor, like we're covering now. This is useful if you need some quick information for learning a topic you might not know yet. In the top left, we have our more common menu options. We have our file menu. This is where we can load and save assets as well as maps. This is where we get access to things like cooking our content for our project so that we could then package the project into the appropriate platform that we want. Our edit is our undoing, copying, pasting, and duplicating, but also quick access to our preferences and settings, as well as our plugins window for adding and removing plugins to our project. The Windows menu is for Windows. This is where we can get access to things like maybe a duplicate details panel. You can dock this extra one somewhere else and now have two details panels. We have our developer tools, things like our debugging and analyzing systems, as well as our saving and resetting layout options. Finally, we have our help menu. This is where we can get quick access to our documentation, our references, quick links to our answer hub and support forums, and other useful things. Understanding the basic layout is a great way to get started. Up next, we're going to cover the viewport. The viewport is our view into our world. It allows us to see what is inside of our level, manipulate those items, and basically visually work with everything. So we're going to take a quick look at it. Our viewport is this giant item in the middle of our screen where we can view our project. We can see what we're working on. And it has a few options. In the top left corner, we have our viewport options. This controls the way the viewport works and what we can see inside of it. For example, we can toggle things like real time and frames per second on. We can adjust our field of view if we want to change it to better match our project. We can toggle cinematic preview on and on. This gives us play controls if we're viewing a cinematic. We have game view, which I'll cover shortly in more detail, and immersive mode, which is basically full screen for the viewport and can be toggled here or with the F11 key. Below this, we have bookmarks. This gives us the ability to jump quickly from one spot to another. You can see here I have 3 bookmarks. I can click on each of them and jump directly to a bookmark, or use the 1, 2, and 3 key on my keyboard to jump to preset bookmarks. If I move my view to somewhere I want, use the control and the number key, I can now have a new bookmark. I can jump from 3 to my new bookmark of 4, which you can see here, I now have a new bookmark I set using the control option. You can also clear them here. Layouts gives us the ability to change how many viewports we have available. By default, we have 1. We can go to layouts, and we can have 2, 3, or 4 in different configurations. These are just the defaults. I can go here, I can choose 3 panes. Now we have 3 viewports. Each viewport is independent. They can all change the way that they appear, as well as they're shaded. So for example, this one is top wireframe. I could change that to maybe left and unlit mode, and now I would have a left unlit viewport independent of the other 2 viewports. I'm going to go ahead and reset these back to default. Now the options next to this are the way our viewports look and the way they are shaded, and also visualization options. So by default, we have our perspective view. We could change this to any of the orthographic views by using the shortcuts or by clicking the options. And then we have our view mode. By default, we're going to have lit. We can change this to unlit, or we can change this to wireframe, or any of the other modes that allow us to better visualize our options. And all these details are covered in the documentation. Lastly, we have show. This changes the way the editor shows different parts of your project. And this is for the editor only. So for example, maybe I don't want to see the grid. The grid is this item over here that we use for snapping and various other placement. If I don't want to see it anymore, I can go to show grid, and now the grid will disappear. I can go back to show grid, and now I can view it. Now by default, we're in the editor mode. This is where we can see things like our icons for our actors. We have our game view. It's the G button, or clicking here, and now you'll notice our icons disappear. The game view tries to give you a more game view or project view looking view. It's very similar to if you were to preview it in the editor or standalone mode. It's a quick way of visualizing what it might look like when you run the project. They are separate views. Editor and game view are separate, and the show options are independent. Let me go back to this view. I'm going to grab this material and make my walls glow. Now if I'm working in here, I might start to have a problem because now I have this overwhelming bloom, and it's going to make my level design a little difficult. So I might want to go into show, post-processing bloom, and now it's a little better. Now I don't have the bloom effect, I can work on my editor. But now I want to preview what it looks like. Well, I can go into play, and it's going to show me what it looks like. Or I could go into play in standalone, and it's going to compile a few things and show me what it looks like. But maybe I want to see it quicker. Well, I'll hit my G key, and now I can see my bloom is re-enabled. I've disabled game view, I'm in editor view, show, post-processing, bloom is unchecked. I will enable game view, I will go to show, post-processing, and now bloom is checked. These settings are independent of each other, and they are separate for those views only, so keep that in mind. You could have both of them not show the bloom, and maybe you just simply don't want the grid showing when you're in game view, but it's fine, we're in editor. It's your choice, it's your options. The upper right controls the way we work with the items inside of our view. If I click on an item, we'll click on this cube for example, we get our manipulator widget. And by default, it's going to look like this, and it's going to allow us to move or translate this object. Up here in the top right, we are showing we can select and translate this object, or we can use the W key as a shortcut. Next to that is rotate, or the E key, and scale, or the R key. So we can do W, E, and R to change through our tools, or the space bar to toggle to the next one. Once we have one we want, we can click on one of the manipulators here. Z is vertical, Y is going to be horizontal, usually left and right, and X is going to usually be forward and backwards, or the red one. We can click on them and move the item as such. You can also click on the combined widget. For in this case, we'll click on these two. It's going to be our Y and our Z. It allows us to move it on the Y and the Z at the same time. Now you may notice it's snapping in the world view. I move this item around based on the world's X, Y, and Z. If I click on the manipulator next to this, this will toggle between world and local view. So let's say we take this item, we're going to rotate it, and now it's going to be angled like this. If I want to move this in the direction the item is facing, I need to use local view. World view, relative to the world. Click the icon local view. It's relative to the items itself and its local axes. I'll go ahead and reset that back to default. Next to this, we have our snapping options. We have how the item snaps when we translate, how the item snaps when we rotate, and how the item snaps when we move it. By default, it's going to be set to grid snapping. Surface snapping is an option you can enable here. Grid snapping means the item will snap to the grid that we can see here. Now I have a cube. We'll go ahead and we'll look at our cube here, and we can see that it's kind of off. It's not really snapped to this grid. If we were to move it, it's going to look weird. Well, my snapping's set to 100, and my grid, as you can see, is set to 100. But my X and the Y aren't multiples of 100. It's kind of off. Let me change my snapping to something like 10. Now my grid will get smaller, and now you can see it moves in increments of 10. Maybe set to increments of 5, and the grid will adjust accordingly to whatever you've set it up as. And these are adjustable inside of the editor preferences. This is for toggling on and off the translate snapping, so you can see now it will not snap. We have the same options here for our rotational snapping and degrees, and our scaling snapping and the units for scale snap. Lastly, we have the ability to change the speed at which our camera moves. Well, this isn't very helpful because we don't know how to use that. We don't know how to actually move our camera. Well, it's pretty simple. If you've played a first-person shooter game, or you've used a recent digital content creation software package, maybe Maya or Moto or Max, it has the same layout. The right mouse button toggles the ability to look around. I'm holding the right mouse button, and we can now look around. When I let go, I move my mouse. The W, A, S, and D keys allow us to move left, right, forwards, and backwards relative to our way our viewport camera is looking. So you can see I'm flying around by holding the right mouse button and using my W, A, S, and D keys. And if we want, we can use the Q and the E key to go down and up. Now if you're wanting to move faster or slower, now we can adjust our camera speed. But let's say we go to like 6 and we're going pretty fast, but we want to get in close, and now we're going too fast, but we don't want to let go of our view. You can use the mouse wheel while you're holding the right mouse button to speed up or slow down by rotating it in or out, and that gives you a faster or slower view. Lastly, we have the focus. So let's say we are somewhere else and we want to find something. Let's say we are in a different part of our map and we want to get back to our player. If we know where our player start is in our hierarchy, or we can see it, we can click on that item to have it selected, hit the F to focus key, and now you're going to go and zoom in and focus on that object. Up next, we're going to cover the world outliner. It's basically an outline of all the actors available to us in our world. The world outliner is a window that contains the actors that make up our world. This includes assets from our content browser down here, items maybe from our place mode, such as lights, or even temporary actors that are created when we are running our project. So let's go ahead and take a look at the world outliner. The world outliner can be seen here in the upper right-hand corner. It is basically a layout or hierarchy of all the items in our level. So we can see I have a cube, or I have a text render actor down here, or I have a documentation item, and they're all shown in our hierarchy. For organizational purposes, we can use folders. Folders can be created by right-clicking and choosing Create Folder. You can name it whatever you'd like. I'll name this one Doc. And then you can drag items into that folder. So maybe this text render actor, maybe this documentation actor. Now I have a folder called Doc that contains my documentation actors. I can close the folder to make it more organized, or I could hide the folder and hide those items inside my editor. Now if you delete the folder, no permanent damage is going to happen. Folders are for organizational purposes only. They're simply going to return the items back to the root of the hierarchy. We can also use a parent-child relationship. So I have a cube here. It's a Mesh Awesome blueprint. And I want a light. I'm going to put a point light on top of it. And I want this light to stay with this cube at all times. But if I was to move this cube, well, the light's not going to go with it. If I take the light and child it to that blueprint, so now I have a parent-child relationship, which you can see here in this hierarchy, that item is going to move appropriately. And now the light's going to move with it at all times. Anything you do inside of this world outliner is destructive if it's not to a folder. So I just deleted the light. I could delete my documentation actor if I wanted to, for example, for now. But I'm going to go ahead and undo it. You can right-click on the items and you'll have context-sensitive things. We have the ability to, for example, rename them and edit them. In addition to this, we have a few different ways of sorting and filtering. So we can search at the top for specific items. I could type in player, and I'm going to return anything that has a label of player or even the type of player. So for example, I have the player, which is called player, or I have this item called network player start, which is of type player start. We can also change the additional filter by changing the details panel over here. So I can click on this and we have a few different other options to change it. If maybe we want to sort by the socket type or the type or maybe nothing at all. We can do that inside of here. In the bottom right, we have the ability to change our view options. So let's say I want to make it a little cleaner. I have a large world and I only want to work on specific items. If we click on an item, it'll select it. If we change our view option to only selected, it's going to show only that item. If you click on something that happens to be in a folder, it will go ahead and show the folder hierarchy and just that item. If we want to, for example, play our project and we see our temporary items in here, these are our yellow items in our hierarchy, we can hide those by going hide temporary actors, and now those temporary or runtime actors will not show up inside of our outliner. If we want to group our actors to make things a little easier, our folder structure allows us to organize them inside our hierarchy. However, we cannot really move items or affect multiple items at the same time unless we select them all at once. And sometimes we don't want to have to do it over and over. So in this case, I want to select my arena. I'm going to select all of my walls. You can right click and choose group or Control G, and this will group them together into one group. And you can see this little green widget on the corners that indicates this item is grouped. If I clicked on this item, it's fine. These are individual items. If I clicked on any of the walls, it's going to select the entire group, and any actions I do affect the entire group. You can, of course, right click and do groups and ungroup them again to ungroup the items, and they'll go back to normal. One thing you can do when things are grouped together is you have the ability to lock and unlock them. So by default, they're locked. If you unlock them, this will allow you to temporarily work on individual items in that group until you lock them back up. I'll go ahead and lock it, and now it's back to it. You can also individually remove items by simply removing that individual item from a group once you've unlocked it. That is the basics of our world outliner. It is, again, a window that contains all the actors that make up our world. Next, we're going to cover the details panel, which allows us, once we've selected items, to adjust the properties and view the details of that actual object. The details panel is the panel that shows us the details, or the properties, or the settings, or the options of objects we've selected inside of our level. If I click on an item in our content browser, nothing is going to show in our details panel, which is here in our bottom right. we need to select something inside of our level, like the static mesh or our player, even selecting something in our world outliner. And now we're going to get our details panel. Our details panel is going to show us a few different options. It's going to primarily consist of our top part here, which shows us our components that make up this object, and then our details section at the bottom, which is our properties that we can adjust on this object. Now let's go ahead and look at it in a little more detail. At the top, we can change the name of this item easily just by adjusting it here. And then we have a list of our components that make up this object. In this case, we have an instance of a static mesh actor. It's named linear stair stack mesh, and it's comprised of a static mesh component, which we can see here. We can add additional components if we want to add something else, maybe more meshes, maybe more lights. Basically set it up how you want it. Let's add a point light to our stairs, and we will move it into a position a little bit better. We'll move it maybe to here so it gives a little bit of a glow. And we like this. We like the way this is looking. We actually have to do two. We'll delete one, and we'll move this one. There we go. And we like this, and we want to reuse this. We're going to reuse it maybe multiple times in multiple places. We could create this static mesh again, we could add the light, or we could easily convert this all into a blueprint because we're going to reuse it. We can use the blueprint button. That's blue. We'll click on it. We'll find where we want to put it. We'll name it whatever we want, and we'll create it. And now we have a blueprint that is made up of what we had in the item we converted. So our static mesh and its point light. And you'll notice in here, we now have a point light, which is blue, and it's part of this item. We could click on it and move it, and the light's going to go with it. We can even drag and drop in more, and they're all going to be set up the same way. Once we have a blueprint, or if we chose a blueprint, for example, here's our player, this is no longer creating a blueprint, but editing or resetting things back to defaults. So for example, I could open the blueprint editor, and it's going to show the blueprint editor for this player. We have the ability to change the properties down here. So in this case, we have our player, and it's got a different location than the default. Now, how do I know that? Well, the location icon over here, this little reset to default icon, is showing up. It's a little yellow backwards arrow. If we click on it, it'll reset it to the defaults. In this case, 0, 0, 0. I'm going to undo that, put it back to here. Anything that's been changed, you'll go ahead and see that with that icon. Or, for example, you could go here and show only modified properties. And this will show the properties that are modified from their defaults. If you wanted to really easily reset everything, you can go up here and you can reset the changes to the default, and that's going to reset everything back to the default. Going through our details panel, we have options. These options are all unique to the item that we have chosen. This, for example, static mesh here will have different options than this static mesh. Both of these objects may be actors. However, they're going to have different things like a different static mesh assigned to it, different locations, maybe even different materials. And those are all shown here. And this is where you'd adjust them in the details panel. But let's say you're looking for something that you know is there, but you can't find it. We can use our search bar. We can type gravity, for example, and we'll find any results that have gravity in it. There are additional options that are hidden by default. These are our advanced options. If we click Show Advanced, it's going to show us additional options that are considered to be more advanced and therefore hidden by default. Let's say you want to see them all by default. We can click our little eyeball and we can show all advanced details. And it's going to go ahead and show them all by default. One of the last options inside of here is Show Hidden Properties when playing. It's more for debugging purposes. When you're playing, you have properties that are hidden, maybe things like events and the items they're linked to. If you have this checked and you are playing, so for example, let's go ahead and go to our player and hit play. Let's eject and find our player again. If we have the Show Hidden Properties when playing and we scroll down, we'll find things that are unique to only when we're playing, and they're all mixed into here. For example, you might show things like the different settings for the capsule component, different events that are set up when our player is running, and things like that. So if you're looking for something, maybe you want to see it while you're playing, you might want to make sure you have that option checked. Now, one of our last things is, what if we're working on multiple items and we want to be able to maybe copy properties from one to the other. We have a few different ways of doing this. So you have the property matrix. Let's say we select 3 different static meshes. We have our little curve here. At the top right here, we have our selection in property matrix open option. We click on this and our property matrix opens up. This will give us the items we've selected, and it will give us the common properties between them. In this case, they all share things like these actor settings. Let's make this a little easier to read. Here we go. Things like a static mesh actor component assigned to it. In this case, you can see it's multiple values because we have 3 different ones assigned. If they tick or not, options like that. Things that are common between all of them can be all changed at once inside of our property matrix. But let's say we want to change not necessarily multiple things, but maybe compare 2 different items. When we click on different items, we're going to change what we see in our details panel. However, we can go to Window, Details, and open up to 4 details panels. Let's go ahead and open up Details Panel 2. And I'm going to dock this up here on my top left. Now I have a Details Panel 2 and a Details Panel 1, and I can compare things. We'll organize this a little better. Let's say we wanted to match materials. We have this item right here. We're going to go over here. I'm going to make this a pine material, and it's going to go ahead and compile it. And it looks, I like that. Now later on, I'm like, okay, well, I want to match some settings. I want to match some elements that may be different. Instead of clicking on one item, and you now have all these details, clicking on the other, clicking back, and maybe trying to figure out which details are different and which ones are the same, you can lock detail panels. There's a little lock icon on the top right, and it'll lock the current selection. So let's go ahead and choose this item here. We're going to lock this panel, and then we'll choose this item here. You can see this panel in the top left now has our left arm selected. This panel in the bottom right, because it's not unlocked, is going to change to whatever I have. And now I could easily compare. Oh, it's the wood. Okay, I want to make this one wood. Let's see, it's pine. Oh, it's not oak. Okay, there we go. That made it easy. It's pine. We'll go ahead and go here. And it allows you to easily have multiple details panels open to different items by using the lock option. And if you unlock it, it unlocks and you can close it when you're done. The details panel is the panel that allows us to see the properties or the options on our objects and allows us to change them or view them at runtime and design time. Up next is going to be our modes panel. It changes the way we work with our project and allows us to add things like lights and other basic objects. The modes panel. That's the panel up here in our top left. We can access it by going to Window and then Modes. This gives us access to changing the different modes inside of our editor. For example, we have by default our Place mode, Paint mode, Landscape mode, Foliage mode, and Geometry editing mode. Plugins may add different modes to this, but these are the defaults. In this video, we're only going to cover the Place mode. The other default tabs have their own section. Now the Place mode is where you would go to, well, place items into your world. For example, we have our basic section, and we might want to add a cube and maybe change it and use it for blocking out our level, or maybe even just as a temporary placeholder. And you have different basic items you can do and put into your scene from here. You have different sections like lights, cinematic items, visual effects, geometry. This is where you would drop in geometry and then use the geometry editing tab to modify and make something a little more complex than your basic shapes. Volumes, and then your all classes. Now all classes means all classes. If we scroll down, we can actually find things like the Mesh Awesome blueprint. It's a blueprint I created. It's under the all classes tab. We also have things like our third person character, which is a blueprint that was brought in from this template. If you want to look for something specific, you have a search bar. We can look for light. We'll find anything that comes back with light. And everything has a nice handy documentation page connected next to it. There is one thing to note on this. If you are, for example, trying to manipulate something and maybe it doesn't let you, you may be in the wrong mode. If you look on the right, you'll notice I can choose any of these items, or I can choose them inside my viewport, and they work like I expect. But if I'm in the landscape or the foliage, this is where we can paint and modify landscape and foliage, you'll notice I can no longer select most of these items. I can't select them in the outliner, and I can't select them in the viewport. So keep that in mind. You may have accidentally toggled into a different tab, and if so, you'll need to go back to somewhere where you can modify, like your place, your paint, or geometry editing. You will also notice you have shortcuts. So you can do things like Shift 1 for place or Shift 4 for foliage. The modes panel is where you're going to go if you want to add, modify, or change items or change modes inside of your editor. Up next, we have our content browser. This is the item that allows us to organize our content that we use inside of our projects. The content browser. That's going to be this item down here in our bottom of our window. This is where you have basically all of your content stored and organized for use in your project. You can think of it kind of like a visual representation of the files inside of the content folder inside of your project. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. By default, you have one content browser, and it's going to show up down here. And you can add more. We can go to Window, we could go down to Content Browser, and we can have up to 4 different ones. And like other windows, we can do what we want with it. We can stack it up here. We can have it big and nice and organized. We can dock it somewhere else. I mean, it's kind of silly, but they do keep their own things. So for example, I can search for the word mesh. We're going to find all the meshes. And then in this content browser, maybe I'll have certain things. And in here, I'll have all my meshes filtered out. So you can have more than one content browser and keep them set up how you want. We're going to cover the basics of the way the content browser works. By default, it's going to be like this. It's one panel. And up on the top left corner, you can see this icon. That's the sources panel. If we click on this, this is where we get more of our folder view. We can actually see my content folder has subfolders, each of these ones. And we can open them and close them like you'd expect. You can right click and manipulate any of the items like you'd expect, renaming them and such. For organizational purposes, you can actually color any of the folders. So we could right click, set a color. Maybe we'll make our mannequins like a darker purplish blue, and there we go. Now we know what that folder is. And you could easily organize your folders for anything you would like. Choose existing colors, rename them, and it helps for organizational purposes. You have filtering. You can filter by type. So for example, let's say we're in the content folder, and I want to now see all of my textures. I could go to filters, and I could look for texture, and now all of my textures are going to show up. It doesn't matter which folder it's in, any subfolders under where I am currently, it's going to filter out and show me the textures. Geometry, for example, no textures. Mannequin, I have a few. My starter content has quite a bit. Third person has nothing. Third person blueprint has nothing. But content itself contains all the subfolders, and the filters affected. Once you have a filter, you can toggle them on and off just by clicking on them. You can right click to remove them, and you can disable them all or remove all of them all at once. You can have multiple filters on at one time. For example, textures and materials is going to show us both textures and materials. Let's go ahead and reset them all back to default. You have your search bar, which I covered briefly. You type it in, it gives you back the result. The toggle lock option prevents this browser from being used when we use the magnifying glass to browse for our content in the details panel. We have our basic navigation at the top. Let's say we're here under starter content, materials. It'll show us our folder structure. We can jump back and forth to any of them we want. We could also use these arrows to navigate back and forward from where you are, regardless of the actual structure. Now you have a few quick shortcuts at the top. We can add new. This is basically the equivalent of right-clicking and choosing to add, and the add new button is just a shortcut to that. And that's where we can add new things like any classes, any assets, folders, as well as content. And this is where you would add in existing features or content packs. We have our import button. We can also right-click to import into this folder. The file import into levels option is not the same. At this point, we would use the import button, select the content that we want to bring in. The engine will convert it for us to use inside of our project. Save all is going to save all of your modified content. So in that case, I saved my map. It's the equivalent of doing a save all up here, or Control-Shift-S. Now that we have the basics, let's look at some of the other smaller features. In the bottom right, we have our view options. This allows us to change the way, well, we view things. So we have by default tiles, we have our list view, and then we have our columns view. Columns is handy because items like, for example, this blueprint will give you information about it. We can see components that are in it, replicated, the type of blueprint. You go down to textures, you can find information about the size of the textures, what type of compression, maybe even the LOD group it's in. This is what you're going to get when you use the column view. We'll go back to tiles for now. Below that we have things like showing folders, where we can show all folders or empty folders in our view. We have collections, which I'll cover shortly. And then we have other filters like, do we want to show any C++ classes in this project? Do we want to see things like developer content, engine content, plugin content, and localized content? Developer content is content that is specific to you and is meant more of like a scratch area. We have a set of folders that are designed for just my use. The developer folders are generally used for temporary type things. I don't want to really pollute the project with other items that we may not use, so it's kind of like my scratch folder. Engine content is, well, the content of the engine. The engine content itself can be very useful. There are a lot of handy shortcuts in there, such as pre-built materials or textures that you might want to use. Plugin content shows any plugin content for plugins that you have enabled. And then localized content is if you have anything localized. We'll go and disable all of these for now. Now we'll go ahead and we'll cover the last two. Scale, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the size of the thumbnails. Thumbnail edit mode and real-time thumbnails are interesting. So let's say you have a particle. So let's find a particle system. And here's a particle. And let's say if you have real-time turned on, you'd be able to actually see the particle working inside the thumbnail. Thumbnail edit mode is useful if you want to change the way the thumbnail looks. So let's shut off our particle systems. Here's our, let's go back to here. Let's find something like this item. This is a left arm static mesh. Let's say we don't like the way it looks. We can't really understand what it is. You can go to thumbnail edit mode and then drag the actual thumbnail item around using your normal controls with the mouse. And when you're done with it, you can click the Done Editing button, and this will allow you to easily create new thumbnails that better match your item. One of the last items is our collections. Collections, you can think of them as basically shortcuts to stuff, and the stuff is configurable. So let's go ahead and show our collections, and we'll get our new collections item down here. By default, it's going to be empty because we don't have anything in there. Make my thumbnails a little smaller, make it easier. So let's say I want to have a collection of rocks. I'm going to put rock meshes and rock items to quickly find them. So I can add a collection. I'm going to make a local collection, and I'm going to call this rocks. Inside of here, I can put, well, anything. Drag and drop assets to add them to collection. So let's go into here, and, oh, here's a clay. I want the clay in there, and I want that one in there, and I want this one in here. And you can do whatever you want, add them as you need to. And then now if you click on rocks, you'll find anything you added to the collection. And it's a nice shortcut. You can right click, you can rename this, you can set a color to help you indicate what's in there if you want. But this is a static collection. It contains the items we put in there. You have, in addition to static collections, dynamic collections. And these are pretty nifty. So let's say you wanted to find any materials. This filter up here is dynamic. It's going to update as the content updates. And if we want a collection like this, we can do our search and then choose the Save the Current Search as Dynamic Collection icon. We'll click on that, create a new local collection. I'll call this one Material Search. Nope, can't contain a space. Material Search. And now we're done. Now if you look at the top, we have a filter specific for this collection. Searching for materials in the path of /game, which is basically my content folder. You can modify this if you want. Let's say, for example, we didn't want material anymore. We wanted this to be, I don't know, we'll go stone, for example. Click Save, overwrite my existing one or create a new one, and now we have our dynamic search will only show up things that come back with stone. So those are collections in a nutshell. The content browser is an approximation of the file structure, the assets on your storage device. And it's where we can maintain items, sort items, filter items, and store items that we are going to use inside of our project. Up next, we're going to cover the main toolbar. It's our shortcut to many of the features in the editor. The main toolbar, that is this little item here at the top, is our quick access to actually working with the project when we want to do things with it other than creating items or creating the actual world itself. And we're going to cover briefly the basic options. The more advanced options are covered in their own sections. So let's get started. The first one's pretty simple. Well, it saves our current map to disk. It's just a quick shortcut instead of just doing something like current or Control S. We have our source control. If we're using source control, this is where you connect to your source control. Out of the box, Unreal Engine supports Subversion, Perforce, and then Git. And it also allows you to do things such as checking out files and submitting. So it's our quick shortcuts to source control. We have two shortcuts here. The first one opens your current content browser. The second one opens the marketplace on the launcher. Now we're getting into the more detailed items. So we have our settings. These are quick access to project and editor settings. So under Edit, we have project settings, plugins, editor preferences. Under Settings, we have quick access to these, our world, project, and plugins. Under this, we have a few selection options. By default, you can't select translucent items. So for example, if you have a material that's translucent like a window, you'll find you can't select the object the material's on. You can use the T key or allow translucent selection to do that. Then we have other things like making sure you only select items within the box, showing the transform widget or not. For example, there's our transform widget, and we have the ability to disable it, so now we can't see it. It cleans things up a little bit. Below that, we have things meant more for how our project's going to look when we're working on in the engine. We have the scalability settings. By default, it's going to run at auto, and then it's going to adjust itself as you're using it. Note that these scalability changes only affect the editor. They will not affect the final product itself. Same thing with material quality level. By default, it's going to be whatever your engine and your video card and your project supports, but you can change it quickly here. And the same thing with your preview rendering level. This is nice because you may be developing, for example, for both desktop, console, and mobile, and this allows you to quickly change to the other types of shaders and preview. Note it's just an approximation. You should still test on device. The first time you do this, it may take a little while to actually compile those shaders for the first time. When you're working in the engine itself, you have audio. This allows you to turn it on and off in the editor. By default, when you play, you'll have audio working when you're playing, but maybe you want to hear these ambient sounds or something like that in the editor. You can adjust it here. We have a few snapping options, so when you are moving items around, you can turn on and off snapping. You can hide the UI itself, and then you have some generic preview options at the bottom. This is our shortcuts to our blueprint options. This is where we can do things like opening the level blueprint. The level blueprint has very specific uses nowadays. You can use it, for example, to reference things like actors directly from your level, or maybe triggering sequence of blueprints or other cinematic uses. In addition to that, you have things like shortcuts for converting components to blueprints, converting actors to blueprints. It's basically the same thing as our blue button here, except at the top. Cinematics is shortcuts to our cinematic system, matinee, level sequencers, and this is where you would quickly add them and modify them if needed. It also gives you a list of any sequencers you may have in the level. Our build options are, well, building things. You can click the build button, and by default, it's going to build everything. You may not want that, so therefore you have the other options below this. You can build lighting only and change the quality of it. You can build out individual things like maybe just the navigation, the LOD, or even the geometry instead of everything at once. This is where you can do all of your different building related options. After this, we have our play button. Right now I couldn't play because I had a lighting map set up. But this is where you could quickly launch into testing your project. By default, it's going to run in the selected viewport, or this viewport here. So I hit play, and we can test our project. However, you have other modes like maybe testing it in how it would look on a mobile device. Opening up in its own window, so maybe you want to see how it looks when it's in the proper size. Things like a VR preview, if you have VR set up. Standalone game, which is a semi-built version of the project which more closely resembles the final version when you're done. Simulate, which basically turns on any simulations in your scene and allows you to view them in the viewport. You may have physics or particles running. Simulate lets you check them without actually running the entire project. Below that, we have a few things relating to multiplayer. For example, when your player starts, where does he start at? Do I want him to start where my current camera is? I can do current camera location. Or do I want them to start at any player starts? By default, it's the default player start. Let me go ahead and stop this. Below this, how many multiplayer clients will be loaded when you're doing a listen server setup? Or do you want to run it as a dedicated server? And then you have a quick access to your advanced options, which change your level editor settings. This is where you change things like, for example, when you launch it for the standalone window or the new window, what size does it launch and where does it position it, along with multiplayer options such as how many players by default and which port it goes on. Lastly, we have our launch settings. By default, for the most part, you're not going to change these. It's going to launch on whatever you've decided your platform is going to be. In this case, Windows, it'll launch it on my desktop. But maybe you want to test it on a device. If you have a device set up, you could go here and change that. Or maybe you want to try like HTML5 and determine which device is going to launch on for that. Chrome or Edge in this case. You also have quick access to things like the project launcher, the device manager, and then a shortcut to change the supported platforms quickly and easily. The main toolbar is where you quickly start working with your project once you've got it set up. This is where we can do things like building out our lighting and our navigation, testing our project, or working with source control. Up next, we're going to go ahead and review the editor basics. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up our editor basics series. We learned the basics of the editor itself, how to customize it, as well as how to reset it when it all goes wrong. We worked on the viewport. We figured out how to set up multiple viewports, looked at some of the visualization options, learned about the different snap settings, and then how to navigate inside of the viewport itself. We worked on the world outliner. It's an outline of our project, and we learned how we can better organize it to make our project easier to manage. We looked at the details panel, the panel that controls the properties for our objects, as well as how to set up multiple panels to improve our workflow. We looked at our modes panel. It basically controls how we work inside the editor, and then we looked quickly at how to place objects in our world using the place mode. We worked with our content browser. It's our visualization of our file structure for our project. We learned how we can customize it to work how we want, use filters to only get specific content, as well as using dynamic and static collections. And then we wrapped it up with our main toolbar. It's our quick access to our project, our settings, ability to build out our changes such as our lighting and navigation, as well as playtesting our project quickly. Thank you for watching. Hello, my name is Matthew Wadstein, and welcome to the series for the Settings Overview. In this series, we're going to cover things like the editor preferences. What are they, and what is actually useful to us inside of our editor preferences? The project settings. Why should we use the project settings, and what is common for us to change in there? And lastly, our world settings. Why do we need our world settings, and what are we going to override most of the time inside of there? The editor preferences window is the window we use to change the preferences or the settings or are the options for the way the editor works and behaves for us. In the top left, we can go to Edit, Editor Preferences, and we're going to get the Editor Preferences window. In the top left, we have our All Settings option. This is going to give us all of our settings in one large list. If we're looking for something specific, we have a search bar at the top. We can type in grid. It's going to return all the results for what we typed in. Grid in this case. I'm going to clear that out. Next to that, we can toggle some visibility options, maybe show all advanced details by default, or collapsing and expanding all categories. Below this, we have a few buttons we can click on that will allow us to adjust the defaults as well as to recover from any mistakes we may have made. Let's say we've adjusted something. We want this green for our default selection color, and we want it to always be green. We can do set as default. This is going to change to our new default settings, everything we've changed, and then now whenever we use it in the future, those are going to be our default settings. Let's say we want to give these settings to someone else. We have the ability to export and import settings into the individual categories that can accept them. That way we can give these to other people. And let's say we've done something terrible and now it's no longer working right, or we've changed something and we can't remember what we did. We can reset to defaults, and that'll reset everything back to our defaults. As you can see, this is now back to yellow. We have a few categories. We have General, Level Editor, Content Editors, Privacy, and Advanced. Everyone is pretty self-explanatory, so we're going to go ahead and cover just the more important things as a new user that you might want to look at and adjust in the editor preferences. So starting with General, we have Appearance. And we've already covered, well, selection color, but this is where you can change the colors in your editor. You also have the ability to change it based on color blindness or color vision deficiency. It has a few defaults in here. Not only will this change the editor, it also changes the way the viewport and such works, so you can test easily for how your project may work with different color vision deficiencies. You can, of course, go through here. There are other items to change. The colors are important. The ability to make things larger and smaller on your user interface, as well as your graph and grid size, can all be adjusted here. We have our keyboard shortcuts section. Let's say you don't like the way things are set up. Maybe you want to use different keys for navigating the viewport, or you want to use different keys on your keyboard because it's a different layout. You can change them all inside the general keyboard shortcuts section, and you have a primary and a secondary binding in case you want to use two different key sets. Loading and saving is useful because you have a few options, like your autosave, which you can see down here. The autosave by default will show up every 10 minutes. 10 seconds before that, it'll automatically save your project and what you've been working on. You may wish to adjust this either up or down based on what you want to autosave and how often you want to autosave it. This also is where you adjust your default level at start, either the last opened, the project default, or none. Under Performance, this has just got one small thing in here. If you happen to be using multiple monitors, or you're wondering why your project is not running properly when you no longer have it as the primary application, by default, Unreal Engine and the editor will lower the amount of CPU usage and therefore your frames that the project is using with this checkbox. If you uncheck it, it'll go ahead and use full performance at all times. Region and language are important because not only does it change the editor language, by default it's going to be your local language, you may wish to change it, but it changes your preview game language if you're using localization. And then lastly, we have our tutorial section. In the top right corner, we have a hat which gives us tutorials. By default, this will be flashing green if you've never used it. If you don't want that on anymore, you can disable all tutorial alerts by checking this box, and now it's no longer going to flash green. Under this, we have the way our level editor works and is laid out. We have some miscellaneous sections, for example, if things are applied automatically when we're working on them. But more importantly, we have our play section. This is where we adjust the way our plain editor, plain standalone, our different settings here under play are set up. As you can see here, play in new window has this default size. You can adjust it. You can adjust how many will be displayed. You can adjust to common settings if you want to test them out. In addition, you have your multiplayer options in here, default number of players and server port, as well as your default play on device options. Viewports contains how our viewports look and feel. Feel free to go through here and adjust some of the options and try to get a good feel for your viewport. You're going to use it a lot. You can see here we have our default use our WASD keys when the mouse button's pressed, but you can change it to always work or never work, depending on your options or maybe any other editors you've used. And there's a lot of look and feel options in here. We see that previous grid settings that we mentioned earlier when I look for grid, that can change the way the grid looks and feels. Content editors is very specific to different parts of the editor. So for example, content editor's blueprint editor adjusts how the blueprint editor works. The way it works when you're compiling, the way the flow works, the way it has for performance, as well as any experimental options. Anything specific to the blueprint editor is in here. And you will find the same thing for all the other different types of editors. Our generic graph editor, our UMG sequence editor, our widget designer. Any editor has their own unique section inside of the content editor section for those options. Privacy is pretty simple. Do you or do you not send usage data to Epic Games when you're using the editor so they can try to improve it? By default, set to send usage data. And advanced is where you change some of the lesser used, more advanced options. For automation testing, we have an automation option. When things crash, where do you want them to save that crash report? And finally, we have our visual logger settings. When you're using the AI visual logging, this is where you can change those options. One thing to note is this changes how you work with the editor. And since you work with the editor a lot, you should go through and you should customize it to how you're going to want to do it. And if you make a mistake, it's not a big deal. You can always reset back to defaults and you can start again, or you can make note of what you've changed. Go ahead and explore and enjoy changing the settings of the editor and make it customized for you. And if you're looking for more specific information, please refer to the documentation. Up next, we're going to cover the project settings, or the settings that are unique to the project itself. The project settings window is a window that contains settings specific to your project. We can go to Edit, Project Settings, or we click on Settings on the toolbar and go to Project Settings. And we're going to get the Project Settings window. Now by default, we have a few different categories. We have our project category. This contains project-specific items like which map starts up when we start our project, which hardware we're supporting. We have our game category, which has game-specific framework settings. Our engine category, it controls the way the engine is set up for a project. Maybe the way we have our input or our rendering. We have editor-specific sections. How are parts of our editor handled in this project? We have platform-specific sections. Every platform has unique items for that platform, and this is where you'd configure them. And then we have our plugin section, which is where we adjust project-specific settings for these plugins. We can click on all settings on the top left, and it's going to give us all of our settings in one list. This is useful if you want to find something specifically and you don't know where it's at. Maybe we're looking for bloom. We could type in bloom, and it's going to search, and it's going to give us back where our bloom is inside of all of our settings. And of course, we can close that if we no longer want to search. Now we're going to cover briefly the more important and commonly used sections in each of our category. Starting with project, we have our description, and this is where we'll fill in things like the name of your project, the publisher, and items related to that. We have our maps and our modes. Now this one's pretty important. If you've ever actually started playing around with the engine and you've created a new map and you're like, well, why doesn't my new map actually work when I try to play it? It's because your default maps and modes needs to be adjusted. You have your default game mode. In this case, I'm using a third-person template, so it's my third-person game mode, and it has specific settings for that game mode. Below this, we have our default maps. We have one map for the editor, so when the editor starts up, this map loads up, and one for the game. Once you package your project, this is the map that will load up. And then you have a few other advanced options, things like if your multiplayer uses split screen or not, and then your game instance class. This is a very important section to adjust once you start working on your project. Below this, we have a packaging section. This is where you can adjust the final size and settings for your project. You have things like the ability to include your prerequisite installer. You can see that at the bottom of the list on the include prerequisite installer option. Or choosing which maps you include. Maybe you have some test maps you don't want actually packaged. You can adjust them here. Finally, we have the supported platforms. This is just a quick and easy way of adjusting which platforms are supported by this project. So that way when you're running, packaging, and cooking, it's only going to suggest these options, and you'll get an error if you choose something else. In our engine section, we have a few important things, starting with collision. Collision is when you're using physics and items are going to interact with each other. By default, you have a few presets. However, once you get working on unique settings for your project, perhaps you're using a bullet and you want your bullet to only collide with certain items. Your default collision may not work properly, therefore you can create and edit new object and trace channel collisions inside of here. Below this, we have our input section. By default, you can see I have a few inputs already set up. Using the third person template, it's giving me the ability to move a character around. I can jump, I can move, and I can rotate the mouse. But let's say you want to add something else. You need the ability to crouch, or you're not using a template and you need to set up input. This is where you set up new action mappings and axis mappings for your events, for your input. This is also where you can adjust a few other options, such as are you using your mouse to simulate touch, and if you have the default virtual joystick if you're going to use a mobile device. Briefly, we'll touch upon the rendering section. This is where you can make some higher level changes, such as if you're using forward or deferred rendering and the different types of rendering option. But an important part in here is going to be our default settings. By default, we have things like bloom enabled, ambient inclusion enabled, auto exposure, motion blur, other settings like that. Rather than using a post-processor effect or adjusting your camera or adjusting other settings, at a project level, this will allow you to enable or disable them inside of this section. Below this, we have our editor-specific sections. Things like our level sequences. These are the way they are set up. Our importing of Paper 2D. Well, here's some default settings. So your editors that you're going to be working with, these are some settings for that inside of here. Platforms is fairly important, but we're going to cover it briefly on a high level. Individual settings for platforms. I'm on Windows, so let's go to Windows. Those settings will be inside of here. Which version of DirectX or OpenGL might we be targeting? Which icons are we be using for our splash screen as well as our project icon? If we go to Android or iOS, we'll find some specific options up here for if your settings are set up to support iOS or Android, as well as some optimization settings. Do you want to support metal, or what type of renderer do you want to support? When you're in Android, do you have your SDK set up? If not, you have the ability to go to the documentation page and set up your SDK. Which version of Android are you targeting? Is it landscape? Is it portrait? So the individual specific settings for those platforms are all inside of their own sections in the platform category. And then finally, we have plugins. These are specific settings for the enabled plugins for your project. For example, I have the Substance plugin enabled as an additional plugin. So the options for that plugin are here. Same thing with Oculus VR, Image Media, Level Sequencer. Anything that's a plugin, this is where you'll change those options. The project settings window is where you'll go and you'll change the settings specific to your project. The engine category is one of the very important sections because this is where you do things such as how does your project work with input? How does physics work? How does it look with rendering? So if you're going to adjust things for your project, this is where you'd go to adjust it at. Up next, we're going to cover the world settings window. These are settings specific to the world that you're allowed to override individually. The world settings window. this is the window that allows us to adjust or override settings unique to the level that we are currently working in. We can go to Window, World Settings, or we go to Settings, World Settings, and it's going to open it up here on the right-hand side next to our Details panel. Now we're going to go over the more important world settings that we're going to want to adjust on a map-by-map basis. Starting at the top, we have our World section. This is where we can do things like adjust our kill Z. Our kill Z is the Z, the Z, or the vertical axis. This value, if an actor goes below it, is going to get destroyed automatically. So if you have a vertical type level layout, you might want to adjust this value so it doesn't destroy your actors. Our game mode is where we can override the default game mode. Now, I'm using a third-person template, and it uses a third-person game mode as its override. If we were to start up a new map, we're going to find we have an override of none, and we're going to find it uses the project settings, maps and mode, default game mode as the default game mode. Now, there may be cases where you want to use a different game mode. Let's say you have a main menu and it doesn't need all the functionality in your normal game mode. You can create a new game mode and you can override in this setting for just that level. Now we have light mass. By default, the light mass system is set up to give you fairly good results. Now the light mass system is your static built lighting. It uses the light mass system to build and bake out lighting. If you want to override any of these settings so you can refine it to get better accuracy and more accurate results, you can adjust them here. Almost all of these have very good detailed information telling you what's going to happen when you adjust them. Feel free to play with them. Try to get a better result if you use baked lighting. If you don't use baked lighting, you won't need to worry about this section. As an option, if you're not using baked lighting, in this case I'm not, but I still have light maps, you can check the force no pre-computed light option here, and then you can go ahead and rebuild your lighting. And once you do that, it's going to save some space because it's going to get rid of the 11 light maps I have already built, for example, in this map. The physics section is fairly simple. If we want, we can override the default gravity here. Let's say we have like an underwater world and we want to change the gravity just for this level, we would do it here. The VR system options allow us to change things like our default world to meters. This is where we can override the defaults and we can change it so we have a different ratio when we are in just VR. Depending on the scale of your world, you may wish to adjust that. Maybe you want to simulate your player being larger than the world or smaller, and you can easily adjust that here. And finally, we have our tick settings. This is where on a level basis, we can adjust the ticking for this level. So for example, we can set the minimum and the maximum global time dilation, and we can allow tick to work before begin play event fires off, and we can override that here in the world settings. The world settings are settings unique to this level that we're working in, and it's where you can override or tweak and adjust level specific settings. Up next, we're going to go ahead and review all the things that we've covered. And with that, we're going to go and wrap up the settings overview series. So we started by looking at our editor preferences. These are the preferences specific to our editor. Things like, well, how do our graphs look? What options do we have when we are playtesting in the editor in standalone mode? As well as specific content editor options, like for our blueprint or our content browser. We then looked at our project settings, our settings that are specific to our project. Things like the information, the name of it, and our icons and our splash screens. Maybe our maps and our modes, something very important when you actually want to load up the proper map. How to change input, our input settings, as well as the rendering options available to you that you will need to adjust for your specific project. And then we wrapped it up with our world settings, the ability to override our game mode specifically for this individual world or map, quickly change the gravity, as well as our light mass settings to improve the way our build lights look. Thank you for watching.